Hi, folks. Welcome to Hazel's Flight School. I'm Rob Linhart.
I'm Lily Margolis.
And today, we're popping bubbles. So, Lily, before we get started, do you have any questions about bubbly before we jump in?
I'm so glad you asked, because of course I already have a question. Whenever I go to a restaurant and I order a glass of champagne, it always comes in a flute. So why are we tasting in these glasses instead of that flute?
Instead of this silly flute. Well, the bottom line is the classic champagne flute, tall, long, skinny, does a great job of showing off the bubbles, but does a terrible job of pretty much everything else when it comes to tasting wine. It doesn't really give you a chance to get your nose in the glass, really smell what's going on, doesn't give the wine a chance to open up, and bubbles are wine. So the champagne flutes are great for show, they're great for fun, but for tasting, we're just not gonna go there.
That's really good to know. That makes so much sense because I've always wondered that.
Yeah, they just don't do the wine justice.
Gotcha. And another question about champagne I have, it always makes me really nervous when I'm opening the bottle because I don't want to pop the cork and hit anybody. Is there a correct way that I'm supposed to be opening my champagne bottles?
Oh yeah, in fact there is, and we're lucky enough to have Brandon Kendrick from Western Distributing, and he's gonna demonstrate how to properly and safely open a bottle of bubbly. So we're gonna have Brandon open the Cava, and we'll get to what that is in a minute, but we're gonna do this one because it's under the highest pressure, and we'll talk about that later, but it's the most challenging one to open. It's got the most pressure, it'll make the most pop. So we're gonna let Brandon take the risk.
So there's usually a little tab on the side. Grab the tab and pull it, obviously. There we go. And then you've got a little wire spindle thing here. It's always important to keep your hand on top of it while undoing it. And then, some people like to take this off. I like to leave it on. It goes on top of the cork. So I use a towel so that you don't have a flying projectile when it opens. Grab and slightly twist, and you've got a good open.
Easy peasy.
Yeah.
Nothing to it. Remember, it's super important to keep control of that top, and of course, don't point it at anybody. You can do some serious damage.
Pretty easy, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Brandon. That was a great demonstration. That's how it's done. So we've got our bubbly open now. No accidents. We're nice and dry. And we're going to start with a wine made in the traditional or the champagne method.
What does champagne method mean?
Champagne method is what we call, and again, the traditional method, and it's a method that involves two fermentations. So first the winemaker is going to make a still wine, no bubbles. However they want to make that wine, that's what they're going to do. And then they will re-ferment that wine, importantly, in the bottle. So that can create a lot of pressure, which is why you have to be careful when you open these. But that method produces very fine bubbles, and it gives a lot of extra layering to the wine. You have yeast in there that's being used to re-ferment that bottle, and because that yeast is in there with a lot of contact with the wine, that yeast will add flavor and texture as well. So it adds a lot more to the wine when we use that method.
So then that's the champagne method. What is champagne? Is it region specific?
Indeed it is. These days, champagne should properly refer to a sparkling wine made in the traditional method, that is those two fermentations, second in bottle, but only in the Champagne region of France. That is super important. And that's why, for example, here at Hazel's, we have a whole section for champagne, and then we have a section just sparkling wine, everything else.
So are there different specific names for other kinds of sparkling wine if they're made outside of the Champagne region of France?
Well, interestingly, and we don't have an example here, yeah, there's one more really important term, especially in France, called Cremant, C-R-E-M-A-N-T, and really that refers to a sparkling wine made the same way as champagne, but not made in Champagne.
Gotcha.
All right, let's get tasting. So what we're starting with is Cava, which is sparkling wine made in the champagne or traditional method, but made in Spain using Spanish grapes. First impressions?
Little lemony, a little bit of melon flavors, like unripe honeydew would be my first scent impressions.
I'm getting a really nice floral note out of this as well. Nice perfume on this wine. Are you getting any sense of that yeastiness or anything that might take you in that direction? Getting that lemon now, nice.
Definitely getting like the yeast, but it's more textural for me. It's not as much of a flavor component. I can more feel it on my tongue than I can taste it.
Now that is not uncommon, and we talk about that yeasty thing, but these wines, when they're resting on that yeast, or what we call on the lees in the bottle, time is a factor. So sometimes they can be on the lees for a short period of time, maybe just a few months. Sometimes it can be 10, 12, even 20 years. Sometimes it can get outrageous. And the longer that wine sits with that yeast in the bottle, the more that yeast is going to have an influence. So here you're quite right. More of a textural thing, but not really aromatically driving the bus so much.
Is there an ideal like length of time to wait before opening a bottle of bubbly created in the champagne method?
Not really, no. Some do benefit with age. Fine wines can improve with age, but by and large, most bubbly's ready to drink when you get it. So next, we're going to be checking out Prosecco, the most popular bubbly right now out there, probably. Any thoughts on that?
Just a question. I know that this is often used as a mixer. Mimosas come to mind, Aperol Spritz come to mind.
Yeah.
What makes Prosecco such a good mixer in cocktails and spritzes?
Well, number one with a bullet, it's typically quite a bit less expensive than wines made in the traditional method, especially champagne. There's not a lot of what we would consider cheap champagne out there these days. One of the other things that makes Prosecco really popular is often it has just a little bit of sweetness. For something like an Aperol Spritz, that can balance that bitterness nicely. The other thing that really is important here is the method. Usually the method for Prosecco is a little different and tends to bring a little more fruitiness to the wine.
And does Prosecco have a regional distinction too?
Yes, it does, actually. It used to be that Prosecco was the name of the grape, and that was associated with that method. But what happened was people in other countries outside of Italy started using that and using that name, and in the Prosecco parts of Italy, they got a little annoyed about that. So they changed the name of the main grape to Glera. That's not the only grape that can be used, but really the main Prosecco grape is called Glera. Now this wine is made in a slightly different method called the tank method or the Charmat method. So it still gets 2 fermentations. The first one happens just like in the champagne method. So you make a still wine. Then you'll do a second fermentation, but usually it'll be in a really big tank and it'll build up all that pressure in the tank. And then they'll transfer that to bottle and keep that pressure. That's the method here. It's for bulk production, it's simpler, it's easier to do in large quantities, a lot less expensive, and that's why we can usually find even really good Prosecco for a lot less than your typical champagne.
Nice. Let's try it.
All right. Really good mousse, a lot of really good bubbles in this one.
Yeah.
Prosecco doesn't always have that, but go ahead.
Yeah, super bright. I thought the bubbles seemed bigger
Yeah.
and much more explosive than they did in the Cava.
Yeah.
And I noticed a really good pear flavor in this one that really stood out for me.
Yeah, pear and lime zest are what I'm getting here, and that's typical. But you may have noticed not a lot of that yeast influence. And that's because in that big tank, the amount of yeast compared to the amount of wine tends to be quite a bit less. And so that influence, not necessarily there. For the record, Prosecco can be made using the champagne method, but it's pretty rare. We almost never see it. On to the third and last. Now this happens to be a rosé. What we're talking about here are Pet-Nat wines, the hot new sparkling wine that's out there.
What does Pet-Nat mean? Is that a regional distinction? Is that just the name?
Pet-Nat is short for French pétillant naturel, or naturally sparkling. It's also sometimes called method ancestral or ancient method, widely considered the first method for making sparkling wine. And it really isn't a method. Really what it is get your wine going, it's fermenting, it's in barrel or tank or whatever, and then you bottle it while it's still fermenting and it finishes, and so any bubbles it's going to create stay in there. So only one fermentation in a Pet-Nat, and it happens partly out of the bottle, partly in the bottle.
So could a wine be a Pet-Nat? Like, could any wine be a Pet-Nat technically then, if it's based on the way it's made?
If you bottle it while it's still fermenting and get the bubbles in there, pétillant means bubbly or lightly bubbly. So you can't really have a Pet-Nat without the bubbles. If you do have a wine with no bubbles, it's just a natural wine or a natty wine or unfiltered or whatever you want to call that. All right, let's check it out. Now again, for the record, Pet-Nats don't have a regional distinction. Anyone can make them. They do get made in France. They get made all over the world. This one happens to be coming from Colorado. Local boys getting the job done. Yeah? What do you think?
I like it. Raspberry flavors. I like the size of the bubble. Easy to drink.
Great freshness. Now, you will notice, and I certainly noticed that typically with this method, not as many bubbles as we would find in the other two methods. But that is what it is. Pétillant natural, and Pétillant again leaves kind of lightly sparkling, so usually they're not going to quite have the blow that these other bottles will have. I'm also getting just a little bit of funkiness to it, and that's a polite term for the aromatics that we get from the yeast in these wines, which can often be fairly strong.
It seems a little cider-esque.
Yeah.
It reminds me of trying a hard cider.
Yeah, almost like a strawberry or a berry cider. Yeah. And that has to do with the influence of the yeast, which is just so much stronger typically in these wines. And if we were able to look very closely at the bottom of this bottle, you would actually see some of that yeast left in the bottom. There'd just be a little rim around the bottom, which we can't quite see. These wines will have more or less of that. The main takeaway with Pet-Nats, the category is so broad. The styles can vary so dramatically. So if you're just getting into this style, it can be a bit of a crapshoot. You might have to try a few before you find your jam.
So are all natural wines going to be organic, or are those two separate distinctions?
Ooh, good question. Difficult question to answer. Here at Hazel's, our sort of definition, if you will, of natural wine, we prefer minimal intervention. By and large, I think that's going to be an organic situation, but I wouldn't assume that.
Okay.
Any other questions before we wrap it up?
I think you've answered all of them today.
All right, well, that's going to do it for today. Special thanks to Brandon Kendrick and Western Distributing for their expertise and his nice demonstration on how to safely open a bottle of bubbly. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for coming to Flight School today. Follow us on YouTube and subscribe for more.